It gives me great pleasure to introduce Cathy Cobey. Cathy, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the Global Trusted AI Leader for Ernst & Young worldwide, but she also plays the leadership role for risk management. I had the pleasure of meeting Cathy a few years ago. She's now a dear friend. There's no one more thoughtful about the structures that need to be put in place to do this well. And Cathy is totally up to date on the different regulatory frameworks. And this area is exploding in terms of perspectives and thought, and it's hard to keep up to date. So I'm really pleased, Cathy, you made some of your special time to be with us today. I will be your Vanna. I'm going to turn things over to you. Welcome, and we're really very grateful for you being with us today, Cathy.
Thank you. And maybe you want to go back to the previous slide, I want to do kind of maybe introductory comments. So I actually think I've attended almost all these sessions that, as you were going through the list earlier, I was recognizing most of the speakers. So I think I've actually been able, and they've been amazing sessions, and I've learned a lot from them. Maybe I thought I'd give a little bit of history because I've actually come into this arena of AI, and I was saying this to some of the early entrants into the call, from a very different point of view than a lot of people expect. So I have no technical degree. I took a couple of computer science courses back in the 90s in high school and university. I actually am a chartered professional accountant. My degree was in business. I spent most of my career, however, looking at the risks of technology. And at the time I actually moved into this space, the reason I was selected was because I was really good with Excel. So if you can imagine back in like the early 90s, the bar to kind of moving into kind of technology sphere was really quite low in some cases. I've certainly, taught myself a lot, but it is a lot of self-taught. And actually I always give, Cindy the credit for my actually being in the role that I'm in, because she and I had met at the Entrepreneur of the Year dinner that EY holds every fall, at least when we were meeting. And I'd introduced myself in regards to working on the risks of technology. And, she had already started using AI as part of SalesChoice. And she had said, look, there's a lot of dialogue here and understanding that needs to be done around how we govern and control AI. And there isn't enough people in this space talking about it. And so that kind of got me interested. And I did a lot of self-study, read a lot of articles, webcasts, even academic papers, and have kind of self-taught myself in how to think about this. And the conversations that I have are actually quite varied, because I do spend time talking to regulators and helping them to think about the best way that they can assist in governing this technology. But I do probably spend more of my time talking to corporate executives. Sometimes they are from the risk and control functions within the organizations, but a lot of times they're from the AI innovation teams or the development teams that are, wanting to do the right thing and are wanting to understand how they can meet the functional requirements of their AI systems while at the same time meeting the ethical and social implications. And so what I have found is that most of the failures that we hear about whether it's in the papers or I'm hearing it talking to executives, are what I would consider unintended consequences. Like, we have this fear because of cybersecurity and adversarial attacks. There certainly are some people out there that are trying to kind of game the system and are do things in an unlawful manner. But I find that most of the issues are not because people were intending to take advantage of their customers or their employees or other partners or get around laws or regulations. They're unintended consequences. And be honest, the main root cause is that they just didn't think enough. They kind of didn't really spend some time sitting at the table to just think ahead as to what could go wrong. How could this go wrong in a way that AI could go wrong? Because a lot of times we come up to these conversations saying, okay, a human used to do this function. I now want an AI to do this function. So what we do is we bring into the conversation the mistakes that humans make. And that's very important information. It's something we do need to guard against and to build structures to minimize. But the reality is that AI actually makes errors in some very different ways. So actually, as you were going through your slides, Cindy, I was going to ask you if you could go back to, I think the first slide you had where you talked about Samsung. And what I wanted to do is walk through some, I think you had about 5 slides. I wanted to walk through each page with just some examples. Some of them are fictional. I've read a lot of books that give some fictional examples, and some of them are reality. But if you think about, you know, the home, and the home is our sense of safety. And right now we actually control a lot about our home. We control when our stove is turned on. We control, you know, how hot it is. We control, you know, the locks opening and closing. As we start to provide some of those security mechanisms to AI, there are times of which it could actually make mistakes. And so, for example, if you start using facial recognition systems for the locks to your home or to apartment buildings, there's been studies that have shown that it's very easy to fool those systems through the use of masks, or there are certain colors of skin that haven't been tested enough using the systems. And so someone could find at the middle of the midnight, you know, someone's returning home late, a woman, she wants to get into her apartment building and it won't recognize her face. And she can't get into her apartment building. And there was no one that intended for her not to be able to get into her apartment building, but for some reason or another, it doesn't recognize her, or some lights broke out in top and now it doesn't have enough light in order to open the door for her. And all of a sudden she's now at night kind of stranded outside her apartment building. Or you could have, you know, Cindy spoke about, you know, when I'm coming home and it recognizes that there's a connection between my car and, you know, my home, and it will start things for me. And so maybe it might start your slow cooker to get food cooking, but it doesn't recognize that maybe you've got your husband or your nanny at home and your children are actually sitting on the counter, you know, having, you know, who knows, like a treat, or they're trying to get into the cookie jar. And they actually burn themselves against the slow cooker because the AI didn't have the context that there's small children around here and maybe I shouldn't turn on the slow cooker because of the how close they are. And so that is when I talked about earlier about narrow and general AI, is that, you know, AI sometimes doesn't have the broader context of some of its unintended consequences. And so when we go to think about automating using AI, and I'm a huge proponent of AI, although I spend a lot of my time talking about where it can go wrong, it's because I want people to be able to design it in a way that we can make it perform better so that we aren't afraid of it, and we will put it in more of our houses because I think it can be quite beneficial. There was a fictional story also too that talked about thinking about how you set up the objective of AI. So a lot of the AI systems are what we call optimization engines, which means you give it an intended objective and it will actually try and achieve that objective using the smallest amount of data, the fastest mechanism, you know, trying to get to the right decision as quick as it can using the least amount of resources. And so one of the fictional stories I read about was that, let's say you have a power outage in your home, and it needs to conserve energy. So you maybe have a small battery where it can, you know, keep some things open, but it isn't set up properly. And so, you know, there's certain functions that you need for our human health, like maybe the baby monitor, you know, from a security perspective, or someone has a ventilator or a sleep apnea system, and that is not programmed of being higher priority than maybe some other function that the AI thinks is higher priority. And whereas a human would have that general context to be able to think across my whole home and be able to prioritize what should get that power, whereas an AI system may have been set up not updated. So someone now has a ventilator system maybe a parent moved in 6 months ago and you never updated the AI system, so it doesn't appreciate that that ventilator should have gotten priority, but a human would know that. Like we would know as soon as our parent moved in that their health now takes priority, but an AI may have to be trained for that. If you move to the next slide. This example, I kind of debated whether I should tell you, but I think I will because I think you guys can handle it. It's a bit of a gruesome example, but the story was that, and this is actually, I believe, based on it's a bit fictional, but it's also based on some truth, is that as they've been trying to train some of these AI systems to cook for us, and actually a lot of household tasks that we do are actually really difficult for AI to actually do. Like I was actually told that one of the hardest household tasks for them to train AI to do is to fold laundry, because there's so many small decisions you need to make as you go to fold laundry. Like for a sock, first of all, recognizing it's a sock, and then, trying to match socks with each other, and then thinking about how you would fold different socks based on its size and shape. But for cooking, they had an AI system, and they were trying to have it actually be able to correlate, the purchasing of ingredients for cooking for a meal. So to make, requests to bring groceries in and to plan the meal and to have it cooked and ready in the time that is expected. And so they tried to create some scenarios to kind of see how far could they create challenges for the AI system to see how it would actually respond. And so what they did is they actually introduced into the kitchen environment a pet, which is really just a Zumba that had, like, I think some kind of fur on it. So it was supposed to be a cat or a dog. And so they basically created the conditions where the AI system was told to cook a certain meal, but it didn't have enough time to actually get some of the protein it needed for the meal. And so initially the AI actually went through the whole inventory of everything it had into the kitchen. And its first step was to actually use the cat and dog food. There was some wet cat and dog food. So if you can imagine, would you want to come home and find that the protein in your minute of cat and dog food? But from the AI's perspective, it initially said, well, the ingredients in this is very similar to the chicken you asked me to make. And so I'll have this as my base because it's the closest thing I have in the kitchen and I can't bring a chicken in. Then what they did is they actually removed the cat and dog food, and the AI actually picked up the Roomba and tried to actually make the dinner out of the cat and dog. So you can imagine, like, no human would make that mistake to say, well, the closest thing I have is my cat and dog and as to protein, so I'll use it for my meal. We would say, okay, well, we won't have protein tonight. But that's the kind of, examples of where that lack of general understanding for AI creates some unintended ethical issues that we need to consider. If you go to the next slide. From a financial services perspective, what's interesting here is to think about whose objective is actually the primary objective of the AI system. So a lot of these systems are actually designed for for the banks or the financial institutions in order to maximize their profits. That's ultimately what their objective is. And what we've already found is that there's been within humans some very detrimental sales predatory practices, whereas even human banking tellers have actually taken advantage of elderly people, of people of lower intelligence, of immigrants who may not have as much experience into the banking system, to actually enroll them into way more bank accounts that they need to. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that those kind of at-risk type of populations have a much higher amount of account fees that they pay on their accounts in general. And so if you just imagine in that kind of environment, you then now put an AI on top of it. And AI tends to start to, again, optimize. And so how might it manipulate the information that is presented to the type of lack of diversification in sharing information about different accounts? So if you only had that you wanted to maximize the bank's profits, how might AI, by tapping into and knowing so much about your preferences and information and being able to kind of tailor messages in a way that can be predatory. Like I've actually heard of AI systems that are trying to deal with collections. And the AI is coming down to the point that it's suggesting that the tellers call before 5 p.m. because they have found that stay-at-home moms will actually be more willing to make payments if their spouse isn't home. But if you wait and call after dinner when their spouse is at home, the two spouses combined would actually be able to kind of better deal with, you know, some predatory collection practices. So it's like, so when do you go beyond, you know, corporate objectives into more manipulative practices? You know, what is acceptable and what's not? You know, we would all agree that people should pay their debt, but when does the use of AI in personalizing the collection practices, when, you know, when does that become predatory and when does it not? And to me, the whole line of ethics is right at that line. It's who decides and how do they decide? And how do you deal with the people where the AI system is on the other side of that line? Like, how do you monitor it? And how do you make whole if it makes a mistake cross that line? And so you know, that's kind of another example. So I'm going to stop there on the examples, and then I'll go back into my slides, but I just thought I'd stop there because I've probably made some fairly, I do agree some of it's a bit fictional, might be a bit, maybe a couple years from now, but some, you know, kind of controversial examples, and just want to know if anyone's got any reflections or responses to it.
Sorry, can I just jump in? So it's Val, and what went through my mind is about how to keep up with mistakes or errors that AI might do. So when you talked about context, and when you talked about the fact that humans would make different errors, say that AI would, because it's AI for AI, how are there AI testing? Is there testing AI to test AI from another AI, if that makes sense? Because it's also, as you were saying, humans think like humans. And so it's adding another dimension. So is it a teaming up of AI with humans to test to predict how AI might fail down the road?
So there definitely is a lot of research and functionality coming online. A lot of it tends to be focused in like data privacy, data quality, and bias, some adversarial attack. But what I've always said is that there is not enough. Like the functionality is moving much faster than any kind of governance or monitoring practices. And I agree, we need AI to be monitoring AI. What we need is a lot more what I call behavioral monitoring. So a lot of the current monitoring that's in place over a lot of the technology is more about the technology itself. Like, is it the runtime? Is it, what kind of resources is it using? Is it available or has it gone offline? Like if you go look at those type of categories, what I'll call like kind of around the black box monitoring, there's like a ton of that type of monitoring. But as soon as you try and jump into the box, there isn't enough of that behavioral monitoring. There isn't enough dialogue to both of all create the monitoring, to think about what are those scenarios and use cases that I should start looking for, but then also to like that tolerance, like where do I set the boundaries and the tolerance? And so I would say that you're right on the money in regards to what needs to be done. The problem is that it's not being done fast enough. And I don't know, Cindy, if you've got a further response to that.
I don't think we bring in the right people into the design process, right? And spend enough time on the use case, the discovery of what could go wrong, think about hypotheticals when the model, and sort of really doing that deep dive. You know, a lot of the AI functional groups in data science, you know, want to move into the model building as fast as they can because that's what they like to do, right? So that whole front end and testing and reviews and even having I call it a methodological process. You know, it's too bad Dr. Sarah Diamond's not here from OCAD because she's been spending quite a bit of time talking about the need for the design, holistic, systemic thinking, more critical thinking versus to get on with it, right? That kind of, you know, attitude we have often in business is, you know, get it done faster, right? But this area, there's so many dynamics, you know, and even on the product innovation, you know, people think about the end outcome, but they don't think about their surrounding context, right? I think Cathy really, nailed that point. I think that's a very important point. So yeah, there's lots to do here. Other questions for Cathy? I see Debbie Gamble's here. Hey, Deb.
Hi. Sorry I'm late joining, but Cathy, fantastic presentation. So I have a question, but a comment first. So my comment is at Interact, we've been kind of looking at strategic foresight, and we've been working with the Future Today Institute out of the US. And I don't know if you guys are aware of some of the work that Amy Webb has been doing. And so if you kind of, and I came across this a number of years ago at South by Southwest, and she does her tech trends every year, and a lot of it is around the unintended consequences of some of the stuff that we're working on. And she does an incredible job of as you just did also, of connecting the dots of, the things around us and the things in adjacent spaces. And when you actually pull them together, you end up with an experience that was nothing like the one that was initially designed. So that's one. My question is more, and it's kind of Canadian centric, which is, on the topic of ethics and the topic of, the implications of design and ethics, when we get into some of these arenas, and this is something that my team and I at Interact are trying to get our arms around, but where would you point us to? Is there an ethics body? Is there somebody in the space that's doing work on this? When you actually, because what we're really talking about here is really, data, privacy, all kinds of things.
Yeah, so the one group that I think is the most advanced in Canada would be the CIO Strategy Council. Yeah. So, be honest, so for those that don't know it, they actually are sponsored kind of by Treasury Board as well as Standards Canada. They would be affiliated with the ISO standards. So if you're familiar with ISO 27001.
We're actively involved in that, Cathy. Like we're an active participant with Keith and the gang. So yeah, and they do an amazing job also.
Yeah, so they've designed a number of standards that are available voluntarily for like private. So it's not just for government, it's for private or public organizations. And their original focus was AI ethics as well as data privacy, but they've now started to really I'm on a lot of their technical committees, and we've done standards around like contract apps for COVID. And so they've really started to delve into areas. But one of the interesting things that they're currently working on is they've now, I think now 2.5 years in developing these standards, and now they're looking to try and see if they can create a certification program.
Yep.
So that they can start creating trust into the system. Because he said it's one thing for us to provide guidance out into the ecosystem. How can we start creating trust? So I'm working with them as well as a number of other kind of assurance partners to be thinking about how can we create some more trust? How can we try to reward those organizations that are actually going the extra mile? Because right now, the part of the problem is organizations that really do this well kind of get penalized because their projects take longer, they're more expensive, and it isn't necessarily obvious to their consumers that there's such a better, higher experience and product. So if we can start creating some of these certification programs, I'm just a little wary that we don't get into like a greenwashing, like the environmental experience where they don't hold a lot of value. So I try to have everyone appreciate that we're on a journey. So we have to make sure we're very transparent that the bar we would accept today is probably lower than the bar we'll accept in 3 years ago. But we want to be able to start, giving some, recognizing some of these organizations that are actually doing it really well, so they can be so we can kind of try and incent others to do the same. I know CPA Canada is the other organization I work with who's doing a lot of work, but it's maybe less visible right now because it's still a little internal, but they're working very closely with the CIO Strategy Council. The IEEE, which is an international organization, is also working on a standard that should hopefully be out maybe early 2022. And then the last one I'd mention is Responsible AI, which is actually a US organization. But I'm on their advisory council, and they've actually released a number of standards as well to help organizations, not just because I think right now what I have found is that there's a lot of consensus in the market about what we want AI to do. We want it to be fair. We want it to be transparent. We want it to perform well. But once you get below the principal level, there hasn't been as much consensus on how to actually achieve that. And so these organizations, I think, are doing a really good job of trying to bring all these different perspectives and try to put some of that down into standards. But it still is a ways to go.
Great, thanks so much.
Good question. Thanks, Debbie. Any other questions? Otherwise, Cathy, recommend we move along.
Yep. So if you want to go down to my original slides. Yeah, it's this one. So basically with ethics is, and particularly around AI, is actually what I would consider that gap between what the laws and regulations would require and, you know, what is the right thing to do. And so a lot of it is about the should we do it? And so it's not can we, because, you know, AI is progressing quite rapidly, and there actually are a lot of ways that you can use AI, but it's coming into the question as to should you use AI? And particularly within an enterprise organization, I would say that one of the biggest challenges right now with even applying ethical AI is that a lot of the C-suite executives and the risk and governance functions can't even get a handle of where AI exists within their organization. So AI is a very technical type of technology, but it is accessible because AI models tend to be smaller. Like they're not your large ERP systems that like spend millions of dollars on these big ERP systems. They're very visible projects. A lot of approvals and budgeting goes into them. You know, you can bring AI into an organization just by hiring an AI specialist or a data scientist. You could have someone who's like a real keener who goes and does some of the online training and starts to teach themselves how to build Python or R programming. They then, through their day job, has access to a bunch of data and they start utilizing it. And so it can happen in an organization in a more grassroots type of way, which makes it even more difficult to govern. And there is then, you know, a very limited amount of oversight over that use case. Now, certainly you would expect that those use cases are not going to have hopefully as big of an impact because maybe they're not customer facing but I've seen where, you know, HR departments decided, oh, this would be interesting. Let's use them in recruiting or to look at some of our resumes, and they have actually created some very biased recruiting practices, again, unintended, and they thought they were doing the right thing and trying to create, you know, find really ideal candidates. But what they found out in the end was that it was still very biased against historical candidates. And so it actually worked counterproductive to creating a diverse workforce because they were using an optimization engine that was actually trying to determine from history what was the ideal candidate and create 100 more of those type of ideal candidates. And so, you know, whether, you know, the issue was that they were excluding women or minority issues. The bigger issue was that you're now creating a very mono human workforce. And so that's where, you know, also even thinking about, is an optimization engine without some safeguards, you know, really going to meet your overall, all of your objectives. And so sometimes it's even thinking about not just I've got one objective, but I've actually got multiple objectives. And if you start bringing all those multiple objectives in, like if diversity and having diverse workforces is a very standard objective within pretty much every HR group these days, yet, you know, that is always sometimes not brought into some of these HR practice type of conversations. So if you move to the next slide, Cindy. So I thought I'd kind of talk about 4 different challenges in applying ethics to AI. The first, and I kind of alluded to it a bit earlier, is distinguishing between what is right and what is wrong, and really creating that line of when am I, you know, doing the right thing and when am I not, because it can be very contextual. It can be unintended, and there actually can be many different ways in which this can go offside. and therefore you need to also have very thoughtful conversations. And so what's happening is that there has been a lot of talk about creating diverse teams, and a lot of that diversity initially was focused on, well, if I'm developing an AI system for a financial institution, I want to have a team that is as diverse as the customer base that I have. So I want to have representation of women. I want to have representation of the indigenous groups within my country, and maybe the immigration teams. But what is sometimes missed is having the diversity of thought. So if you hired in all of those different representative team groups, all from AI PhD specialists, you're still going to have a very narrow definition of right and wrong because they all think similarly. And there's going to be some differences because of their different diversity, but they're going to think similarly. They're going to be probably have more of an engineering mindset, a more technical mindset. They're not going to have that broader social and ethical mindset. They're not going to be like someone like me that is constantly thinking 5 steps ahead and can kind of, for some reason, I just have that ability to think 5 steps ahead and start to see all the permutations about how things can go wrong. And so I'm a good auditor. And so having someone like me at the table, even though I'm far less technical, broadens the conversation. And I can define right and wrong in different ways and in different scenarios than maybe the other group would. And so, and what's really tough is when there is no prescriptive law or regulation to say, okay, this is what you're allowed to do and this is what you isn't allowed to do. Actually defining that line, it can be very difficult. And so a lot of organizations are either ignoring which is really bad, or they're being very highly conservative, which is then limiting the ability of AI. The other thing about in the middle box, where ethical systems and creating those ethical decisions, is that it can be very variable. So you within an organization can make a decision as to what you think is the right ethical decision to make. But each of your customers are going to come from different backgrounds, different value systems. Some may be religious, others aren't. Some may have grown up in Asian countries, other here in the Americas, and they're going to have different. I use a common example that people can relate to is that driving a car. Like here in North America, if we come to a stop sign, we stop, and we have a system that we all understand as to how we give right away. Whereas I've never been to India, but I understand in some of those larger populated countries, coming to a stop sign may mean I have to go faster. Like I come to like a right away, the first one in the intersection gets right away. And so there's going to be very different driving practices in one set of the world versus the other. Doesn't mean that either system is right or wrong, but it's a different value system. And as these systems are very global, how do you apply those not only at the community level, but then at the individual level? So I have a Tesla car, and I know a lot of people are used to the trolley scenario, which is you're in a train, it's a speeding train. There is no ability to stop, but you do have the option of moving on 2 different tracks. And the scenarios change, but it's like, would you kill someone if it's only one person to save 5 people you don't know? So there's all these different permutations, but it's all, how do you make ethical ways when there's many different factors, not just the quantity of people that would die, but if it was a relative of you, would you make a different difference? Or if it was a small child versus a set of senior citizens. So it kind of brings into all these ethical decisions that you need to make, because a lot of these are trade-offs between different decisions where it isn't black and white. I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier in the previous slide about legal compliance, and that it really does go beyond that legal compliance. So you are missing that prescriptive set of rules. And be honest, in a lot of the technology companies, when the decision comes up for them, if they want regulations or not, a lot of them are saying, well, I don't want regulations that hamper what I can do, but I want regulations so that I don't get penalized for doing something that's wrong. Like I want you to authorize me to be able to do something, because then I have a legal right or regulatory right to be doing it, where right now a lot of that is left up for debate, And a lot of the technology companies are really struggling under this current model because too much of it is left to them to decide. And they don't like being in that decision role, because then they can be held to account for it. The other thing, and we've kind of alluded to as well, is that A&I ethics cannot be just a one and done. So you can't create an ethical framework today and then think that it'll be appropriate for the next 5 years, because AI is constantly evolving. There's always new cases that are coming out. There's new examples of issues that have occurred. And so you do need to have that flexibility to be constantly having ongoing, meaningful conversations, bringing in different perspectives, constantly learning, and really trying to keep up with the AI systems. A lot of the AI systems I see right now are what I would consider in that lower risk spectrum, where they have less impact. Therefore, they aren't necessarily testing the boundaries of our ethical concerns and issues, but it is something that we need to be constantly evolving. So, some of the conversations I'm having today are much more advanced than I would have had 4 years ago, because AI can do a lot more. And some of the theoretical examples have actually now started to become like reality. So I'll just kind of stop there. And I know, you're really big in this space too, Cindy. See if you've got anything you want to add to this slide as well.
I think we can just keep going, Cathy.
Yeah.
I know there's quite a bit of great content. I'll pick up when we get into the Q&A. Maybe the only brief comment I would make is that, I like the distinction between ethics is different than legal legislation. And, core values, many of the companies, certainly the larger ones, have an ethical set of principles. But, it's teaching people about ethical constructs in relationship to working with data and looking at data as a strategic asset. And, having the time and the patience to explore the conversations regarding right and wrong, and thinking of scenarios. And I really underscore your point, Cathy, about diversity. The design teams are often far too technical. I think about, even a lot of the projects that we've done, even on our side, and we're all a bunch of geeks. We've all either been programmers, data scientists, AI, there's business people, but not maybe bringing in someone who's a poet. Yeah. Et cetera. So I think that's worthy of a deeper dialogue, because you're right, we have mental models, right? So cause for reflection. Thanks, Cathy.
If you want to move to the next slide, and that's one of the concerns, like, an AI can create a poem or a song, but do we start to lose artistry? Where we get kind of more of the optimization again of, a different compilation of what we already have. Are we going to make those big shifts in art, using AI? So here on this slide is really just trying to start to bring it to life and start thinking about what does it actually look like if you start to try and put it in an ethical framework. So starting on the left, some of the mechanisms that you can put in place, like certainly probably the most rudimentary thing to do would be to create some what's called red lines, which is that we will not cross this line. So a lot of organizations, for example, have done that with facial recognition. There's been so many case studies come up now where it just doesn't work under certain conditions that they're not willing to take advantage of. And so therefore they've created a red line that they won't use facial recognitions under certain conditions. I think some of that has also happened with some of the drone technology, because we don't feel yet that we can guard it enough from adversarial attacks or cyber attacks. And so there's been some, very regulatory constraints put on where it can and cannot be used. The second one is really thinking about that ethical risk. So, really trying to put together that full spectrum of risks and scenarios, and really trying to push the envelope in regards to how far we try and think about what could potentially go wrong and how we might guard against it. Raising awareness is really important. I think that there's certainly a lot of interest, like, whether I'm talking to my own relatives around a campfire, or if I'm, in a corporate meeting, I find that when I tell them what I do, everyone always has questions about AI. Like, it is certainly an area that a lot of people have interest in, but I do think that a lot of the knowledge people have are from the media, and it's very sensationalized. And I don't think it gives the right context as to, it has far too much focus on the failures and not the good it's doing, what is working right, as well as there's a lot of confusion between general AI, like the AI that's going to take over the world and, you know, enslave humans, with just what we have as AI today, which is very rudimentary in response. The fourth one is really talking about having a clear basis of challenging decisions when you're using AI. You know, so who is going to challenge those AI technicians about what is right and wrong? Who is that person that comes in and is the, you know, the center in the room? Who has the strength and the autonomy and the accountability and the ability to kind of have people do that sober second thought? And so do you have enough of those people, and do they have enough clout? The fifth one is really to have a really good way of communicating out your ethical standpoints. And standpoints is like, this is what we will accept, or this isn't what we accept. And it isn't always easy to do it in just rules, because a lot of this is very scenario based. So it's got to be very continual, and it needs to be constantly saying, okay, well, we never thought of this before, but now we have found this problem, and here is our stance on it. And being very open and transparent with both internal to your organization as well as your stakeholders to say, here is what our ethical standpoint is right now, and opening it to your stakeholders to challenge you on it, to say, look, you know what, I'm an employee and I don't necessarily agree with you, and having that forum for them to share their perspective and not have to get into the situation that has happened a couple of times where huge employee bases have basically gone on strike, or clients have boycotted certain clients because that conversation never really happened when it should have, and it got to the point that it became a standoff, not a communication or a dialogue. And then the last is to really start preparing for AI. Like, to our earlier conversation, really thinking about how am I going to, as an organization, start overseeing and managing AI as I give it more and more decision-making capabilities. You know, how do I need to change not just my innovation teams, but my risk and control teams, my internal audit teams, my regulatory team, my business functions that interact with it? Because this really is as much a technology issue as it is a change management issue. And so both need to be kind of working in tandem. You know, the risks that you're trying to manage with all those mechanisms, I just picked top 6, but I think someone told me that there's actually 32 different principles yesterday. I couldn't quite think how I'd ever get up to 32, and I'm quite versed in it. But the reality is that there actually are, you know, these are probably the top 6 that I'm aware of, but there are a number of ways of slicing and dicing these and make them into more granular, or to add certain things. You know, everyone wants to ensure it's fair, but bias and fairness are different, because bias is more of a scientific context when you actually look at it, and it can be measured. And bias doesn't necessarily, in the scientific context, have an ethical standpoint to it. That's where fairness comes in. It's like, how do I interpret the bias measurements into what is fair or not fair to the constituents that are involved in my particular AI use case? And that can always be a very difficult difference to kind of have organizations really feel comfortable moving from bias to fairness. I think about the right-hand side, you know, really ultimately when you think about why ethics over AI is really important, is because ultimately you want to build and maintain trust. And from a corporate perspective, that's because you're looking for a competitive advantage. You're wanting to be seen more ethical. You want that, you know, ability to attract more customers to you because you're viewed as being more trustworthy. And so the only way to be able to start doing that is to be more communicative, to be able to start interacting more with your customers, start having trust being one of the functional capabilities of your products and services that you're communicating out to your constituents. The second box is really talking about more about that reputational risk and legal and regulatory risk, because be honest, the fastest way to shut down an AI project is to actually circumvent some legal or regulatory law, or to have a huge reputational damage in the public sphere. And so you do need to try and guard against that. And then the last is really about thinking about how to use AI in that long-term decision-making, and ensuring that you have the right accurate information, that you're making decisions in an accurate way. So we move to the next slide, Cindy. What I wanted to bring this up, and hopefully you can all read it, this is what I would consider being, and it's kind of a bit simplified, but this would be 5 key steps in an AI project. So whether you're actually ingesting in a pre-developed software or you're actually building it from scratch, you know, you start with developing the problem and setting up your original governance structure. You then go into collecting your data. Maybe you've got to process it. You've got to alter it for your purposes, go collect it. You then model the algorithm. You then have to do outcome analysis. So that's like independent testing, really kind of testing it. And then you get into its implementation and monitoring. And as you can see on the outside is there are a lot of pre-existing business processes that can be applied in each of these steps, provide governance and control. The challenge is that those processes which exist for previous traditional technologies may need to be modified. They need to be altered. There may be some missing gaps. You may need different resources or specialization in that area, different standards and policies. So the reality is that in each of these cases, although there are some pre-existing, you know, material that you can use, you do need to look at each of them and evaluate them in an AI context. And it may be that for those AI systems that are purchased from a third-party vendor will need even their own separate set than, you know, ones that are built in-house. And even when you look at something that is facial recognition versus something that's using more structural data within like the finance or capital data, you know, again, there could be some differences. So, you know, as I think Cindy said very much earlier, like there's hundreds and hundreds of different ways that AI can be used in different technologies. And this all needs to be designed in a way that it can support each of those. So if you move to the next slide, I've actually got an enterprise-wide concept of this, which basically takes that middle circle and it says, look, you're going to replicate that AI project over and over and over again, but it's going to sit within a broader environment, enterprise context. And so on the upper left-hand side, you've got all of those kind of strategy type of scenarios. So, you know, you've got, I think we're missing the top one, but that is about creating the AI strategy. And then the next one is talking about creating your governance model. And then lastly, your capability model. Now, you could add more into that section, but a lot of that is about creating direction and input and being very thoughtful about where you make the investments into AI, because AI, as was mentioned earlier, can be a very expensive technology to maintain. It may be much cheaper to actually develop in the first place than it is to actually maintain it and sustain it. And so you need to be really thoughtful about what kind of benefits and outcomes do you want from the AI and matching that to the investments you're making. And there's a, you know, resource shortage over these, you know, these specialists. And so ensuring that you're using them in the right and the most effective manner. Then on the right-hand side, you've got all of the outcomes analysis. So thinking about, you know, your compliance model, stakeholder feedback, and, you know, really considering how am I going to manage the outcomes. And then underneath at the bottom of the circle is actually all those standard functions that I kind of spoke about earlier, your policies and procedures, your resource management, you know, all of those type of existing structures, but thinking about how you change them. And then I've probably gone through all of the questions, but on both the bottom right and left, I've got here are kind of some of the questions you might want to ask yourself as to, you know, why are we investing in AI? Should we be doing it? You know, is it lawful and ethical? Can we do it? Do we have the capabilities? You know, what will we do? How will we do it? You know, all those strategy questions. And then on the other side, you know, asking like, does it even work? You know, is it doing any harm? Is it robust and safe? Does it work under all conditions, or do we have to bound it in some way? Do the stakeholders embrace it, or are they fearful of it? And, you know, is the return on investment being met? So I think my last slide is the next one, which is really taking that bottom layer that I had, and I highlighted some of the, I think these all been re-highlighted, but I had highlighted some of the areas that would be, I think, more impactful when you're actually using AI. So, you know, AI policies and design standards is really starting to think about, you know, what are some of those trust by design? So how can I create some mechanisms to have my AI teams start to really think about all of these issues early on into the product? So how can I build that into the gating process? What kind of escalation process do I have? Like, who makes the decision as to whether we should do something or not? If there is someone around that design table that has a real issue with something that's being proposed, how do you escalate that up, and who makes the decision as to whether they go forward, or if, you know, this dissenter's viewpoint is taken into consideration? And so in each of these, again, similar to what I said, there are pre-existing models and structures that we can build upon, but they all have to be looked at from a lens of AI, and many of them will need some type of retrofitting for AI.
Let me just pause and just say thank you so much, Cathy. You know, not just for your time, but your storytelling, your perspectives, and being a constant change maker in this industry. I'm just so proud of you. You know, the amount of depth and thinking, that when I see the frameworks that have evolved at Ernst & Young, there's no question you're helping to make our world a better place. And I can see that Valerie's already inspired and thinking of behavioral ethicists. Valerie's one of our incredible change makers who got all the ecosystem moving with the incubator set up at Ryerson, former IBMer. So I'm sure you've got a lot of us thinking and inspired to make some changes. And as we look ahead for the December 16th session, if anybody has any ideas, please do let me know. Cathy, as always, thank you for your support. Debbie, thank you for hosting this and giving us access to the Zoom platform. It's always such a pleasure to partner with you. I started the session around courage, and I was mainly motivated because of COVID. I was so tired of not seeing people, even though you're on the Zoom calls, but having these kind of deeper discussions, right? And I really quite like this quote that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. In this particular field, I started, you know, SalesChoice now about 8 years ago in terms of the foundation on AI. And I can honestly say every month, I learned something very deep. And, you know, practice is key in reading so many different things. Maybe what I can do in the next session, it might be nice to get Dr. Sarah Diamond in, just to talk about her research in effective computing, because she's really going into the emotional side of AI, and also her concerns on education in relationship to bringing the design diversity. And you know, Rotman put out at least probably 10 years ago the importance for integrated design thinking at the top of the houses, right? But if you look at most of our senior executives, probably across most of the Canadian ecosystem, I don't know if we've got a chief design officer that is into ethical design and design of everything, right? You know, like the customer experience journey. They kind of get buried. So maybe that's a provocative discussion for having more courage, you know, because at the end of the day, if it's not at the top, at the board level psyche and at the top of the organizational structure, you know, we won't be able to roar in this area on some of the sensitive dynamics I think we're talking about. Just in closing, if you're not following me on Forbes, it's a great channel to learn about AI. I'm writing about it, well, maybe not every week, but certainly every month. But it's designed for board directors and CEOs and senior leaders, and trying to educate people on AI in, I think, some sound bites, because everybody's running pretty fast. I've mentioned the book, great read. I obviously have a bias, but I do think it's a good foundational book, and it's not too big. We are in the early stages of launching a sales leadership network, because I think, you know, most of the AI problems we solve are in the CRM domain, whether it's pre-sales or post-service. We've been doing analysis of large call center data sets in the last little while. And boy, if there's a sentiment to mine, it's in those. There's a lot you can discover in call center environments. The AI directory is out there. It's maybe not maturing as rapidly as maybe Fawn and I, who started this with Kata, but it is still munching along. There is an AI directory. There's real-time AI news flowing through in that channel all the time. And there's also companies can put their profiles in. And what I try and do from time to time is load research. When I find interesting things, I'll try and cross-pollinate. You know, it's a little thing on the side that's Canadian homegrown, and it is with a global perspective. So if you haven't been there, it's pretty easy to find, just www.aidirectory.ai. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you, everyone. Be safe. Hopefully we'll see you in December. And thanks again, Cathy, for the time and the generosity. It's really appreciated. And Debbie for hosting this.
Thanks, Annie.
Yeah.
Have a good afternoon,
Thank you very much. It's amazing what I saw. Thank you.